Good afternoon, welcome to VANIK-IAS. We'll discuss current affairs of 16th November and first to discuss about climate change. Okay. Environment, climate change. How mangroves helps in averting climate change risk, right? At present, climate change is the most biggest global problem, and now ongoing we have the COP27 in Egypt, right? Conference of Parties, COP27 in Egypt, that is the climate change summit. That's why climate change is always in the news. And how mangroves help in averting the climate change risk. India joined the Mangrove Alliance Climate, that is MAC, Mangrove Alliance for Climate, MAC, Mangrove Alliance for Climate, MAC, launched on the sidelines of the ongoing United Nations Climate Summit in Egypt. The alliance was launched by the UAE and Indonesia and India, Australia, Japan, Spain and Sri Lanka, right? UAE and Indonesia. It is launched by India. These are launched by UAE and Indonesia. And India, Australia, Japan, Spain and Sri Lanka have joined as its partner, that is Mangroves for Alliance for Climate, that is MAC. Very important fact for prelim, MAC. What are the mangroves? Mangroves is a tropical tree essentially adapted to thrive near the coastline, brackish water and loose and wet soil. These trees cannot survive in cold temperature. Tropical tree, essentially adapted to thrive near the coastlines, right? Mangroves it is a species that's present in the coastlines, are during the ecotone area. That means where two biomes they meet. That is the, for example, your aquatic environment and terrestrial environment. They meet those areas. There mangroves are generally seen, right? They in brackish water, loose and wet soil. They are very deep rooted. Their root is very deep, and loose and wet soil mangroves developed in those areas. These trees cannot survive in the coldest temperature. Next, a characteristic feature of mangroves is their tangled prop roots. They have tangled prop roots like this, right? These roots allow the trees to survive in the daily tides and also capture sediments while slowing water flow. So these roots, they capture sediments and also they survive during the high tide, allow the trees to survive during the high tide, right? Survive the daily tides. Tide means when the these crest become very high. That means the sea water that comes towards the coast, very long area, that is high tide. In those, during the high tide time, the features of mangroves are there. They protect the coastal areas, right, from erosion of the soil, because they keep the soil intact by their roots. Okay, so two functions, major functions of mangroves are that they keep the sediments by their roots and also they protect the coastline from flood or during the times of high tides. Then global mangrove extent. How many global mangrove extent? Maximum in northern and central America and Caribbean region, then South America, then western central Asia, then eastern and southern Africa, Middle East, South Asia, then Southeast Asia, East Asia, Australia, then Pacific Islands. So there is estimated global mangrove extent, right, of different countries and continents. Okay. The estimated global mangrove extension for 2020 is the state of the estimated global mangrove extent for 2020 in square kilometer, the state of the world's mangroves 2022. Mangrove serves a multiple purpose in their ecosystem, including the protection, filtration, multiple. One is protection, that is protection of coastlines. Filtration, that also filters the water, right, absorbing various nutrients and wastewaters. Then disaster risk reduction, The prominent feature is disaster risk reduction, right? As they protect the coastline or the coastal areas from flooding. Mangroves protect the coastal areas from flooding, right? So they help in disaster risk reduction. How do mangroves help in mitigating climate change effects? Mangroves forests stabilize coastlines, reduce erosion, they stabilize coastlines, right? They reduce the erosion because they keep intact the soil areas, encourage biodiversity. These areas are very rich in biodiversity. Various species develop in those areas, especially because that is both terrestrial species and marine species can develop in the mangrove areas. So that is a fish that provides shelter to the fishes as well. Fish cultivation also occurs in those areas. Shield coastal communities from the sea level rise. Anytime sea level rise, they protect the coastal communities, that they protect the floods and nature disaster like hurricanes and cyclones. Hurricane and cyclones, when huge amount of high speed air that wind that comes, then suddenly what will happen? The mangroves, they protect the slow down the speed of air. That's why the effect of hurricanes and the cyclones that get reduced. In 2022 State of the World's Mangroves report prepared by the Global Mangrove Alliance finds that mangroves prevent more than $60 billion in property damages and reduce flood risk to 15 million people every year. So the economic cost, now we will see the economic relevance of mangroves. According to World Mangroves report, that mangroves prevent more than $65 billion in property damages, right? If you consider an area without mangroves, then this much. If you consider the world without mangroves, then will additionally lose $65 billion every year. Also, it reduce the flood risk to around 15 million people every year. Flood risk to around 15 million people every year, right? So now the government is protecting the mangroves. It is one of the method in which we can protect our mangroves forest and also to reduce the effect of climate change, especially in case of disaster risk reduction or the mitigation or the adaptation efforts. Adaptation means there is a climate change risk is there. Floods are coming. We cannot stop floods, but we will be adapted to it. If you create huge amount of mangrove forest, obviously they will protect the coastal environment. They will protect the coastal areas, the coastal people, right? So around 15 million people are saved. They reduce the flood risk of around 15 million people. This is the economic relevance of mangroves. Then carbon crisis, carbon sink. It is one of the biggest carbon sink. Carbon sink means those areas which absorb carbon. At present, in our Glasgow summit, we have promised a significant. We promised that by 2070 we will have net carbon emission will be equal to 0 by 2070, and we have also around 50% reduction of our greenhouse gases by 2030. So here we need a huge amount of carbon sinks. Carbon sinks means those areas which absorb the carbon, right? And because of urbanization and industrialization and extension of agriculture, now we do not have sufficient of forest lands. So if you are planting mangroves, we have at the simultaneously two and multi-purpose and various purpose of ours is solved. For example, first is disaster risk reduction, second is carbon sink. For example, if you are planting a tree, you are planting a tree in a road, for first example, then that will help for planting a tree in a hilly area, then that will help for reduction, that will act as a carbon sink. But if you are planting a mangrove, then that will act as help you in disaster risk reduction, that will increase the biodiversity, that will control those, that will deposit the sediments, that means it will reduce the coastal erosion, right? And another thing is that will also act as a carbon sink, that it can absorb huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere. Mangroves are one of the most carbon rich forests in the tropics, storing carbon from the atmosphere up to 4 times the rate of terrestrial forest. This makes the mangroves forest is an indispensable tool in achieving the goal net zero carbon emission by 2050, right? So by 2050 we have net zero carbon emission. We have a target of net zero carbon emission by 2070. But if you can use huge amount of money in this protecting this mangrove forest, or we create mangrove forest afforestation, then we can expect that we will reduce this carbon, we will observe the target, or we will achieve the target of net zero carbon emission by 2050 instead of 2070. Okay. Part of the carbon is stored in living biomass. Living biomass means those mangrove forest, while part of the sequestered in the soil. That means some carbon are go to the soil, that enriches the carbon cycle. We have a carbon cycle, right? Dead mangroves decompose very slowly due to the water logging in the areas, making the accumulation of the carbons in the soil last 100 years. In the last 100 years, the waterlogged soil is also a reason why mangroves hold more carbon than the other forests, such as temperate or boreal ones. So as they are waterlogged areas, the decomposition of a particular tree that easily occurs, and so the carbon cycle, we have a cycle of carbon that from atmosphere it goes to the soil, from soil it goes to the atmosphere. It is a cycle that goes on. So by that the trees they get our carbon, right? So, and also for example coal and natural resources, we get natural resources, coal, that is because of the carbon sequestration. So carbon cycle it is going on, and our dead mangroves they decompose easily, so easily, and carbons are sequestered, carbon sequestered by the atmosphere by the mangroves, that carbon easily get transmitted to the soil. According to the State of the World's Mangroves Report, mangrove forests store around 6.23 gigatons of carbon, 6.23 gigatons of carbon with an error margin of 2 plus or minus 2.3. This is equivalent to 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide, 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide, with 87% of that being soil carbon. The loss of even 1% of the remaining mangroves will equate to over 5 to 10 million barrels of oil, or the annual emissions of 49 million cars in the US, right? That means the loss of even 1% of mangroves will equate to over the emission of 50 million cars in the United States. So if just imagine if 1% of the carbon for example, that reduces, that will have an impact of 49 million cars in the US. That much of air pollution will occur. So mangrove forests are very sensitive forests and very relevant forests with respect to environment. So in Indonesia that is the maximum. Then Indonesia, then Brazil, Nigeria, Australia, they have maximum number of mangroves. Mangroves carbon by country and continent areas with selected scaled total carbon. Okay, that is the graph, that is the picture we have seen. Then Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, Australia, Mexico hold 50% of total mangrove carbon. Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, Australia and Mexico, they hold 50% of the total world mangrove carbon, mainly due to their large mangrove areas. Variation in the mangrove concentration are also affected by the environmental conditions. This is the reason why Nigeria is placed third in global rankings, primarily due to the rich soil carbon, even though Australia and Mexico have more mangroves. Nigeria is placed in the third global ranking. Okay. Next, ecosystem. Mangroves usually do not exist in isolation, but supported interconnected terrestrial, freshwater and marine habitats. That means they are between the terrestrial and freshwater and marine habitats. Think the Royal Bengal tigers, river dolphins and crocodiles, and within others vicinity of Sundarbans. So there are tigers, river dolphins, there is Royal Bengal tigers, there is crocodiles. So that is a rich biodiversity area, right? They do not exist in isolation. Many other species they also lives along with the mangroves. The roots of mangrove trees capture sediments, resulting in the formation of new fertile lands. This process also ensures that offshore water is clearly allowing marine life to thrive. Okay. Capture sediments, they capture sediments. formation of new and fertile lands. So in that fertile lands, that marine life, they survive in those fertile lands. Various types of insects and various species, they are seen in the mangrove forest. While mangrove creeks provide safe grounds for the young fish, for young fishes they provide safe ground, providing the food and protecting them from the predators. They simultaneously provide rich feeding areas for the predatory fish. Okay. Then disaster risk reduction. Not only do the mangroves stabilize coastlines by holding sediments together, but also they act also as safely nets against storms and surges. So they hold they stabilize the ecosystem, coastal ecosystem. Also they act as safety nets against the storms and surges. In any time storms came, they can reduce the speed of the wind. In tropical coastal areas, mangroves are the first line of defense against the nature. Are the first line of defense against the natural disasters like cyclones, hurricanes that originate in the sea and oceans. Socio-economic importance of mangroves. Mangroves ecosystem are home to variety of fish. Variety of fishes are seen in the mangrove ecosystem. So that is socio-economically that is also relevant. According to estimates, around 40.1 million of the 52 million marine small scale fishers worldwide fish in mangrove areas. This activity provides critical source of jobs and protein to local and coastal areas, right? So it is that provides 52 million marine small scale fishes are found in the mangrove areas. Mangroves are critical in an estimated 8,93,000 small scale fishers. In Bangladesh and Nigeria, estimated 82% and 89% of fishers respectively fish predominantly in and around mangroves. So 82 or 89 fishers, they predominantly fish in the mangrove areas. So it's the relevance of socio-economic relevance of mangrove areas is huge. Mangroves are also important resources for timber and fuel wood, whether collected sustainably, right? Yes. Then for fuel wood and timber also mangroves are very useful, right? When collected sustainably means when suppose a mangrove forest a particular tree dies, then you can use it as a fuel wood. That is what we call as sustainable use, or use such that the environment will not be hampered. In India, mangroves are found in the Sundarbans, in which extremely rich biodiversity in area transferred into national park. Mangroves are found in the Sundarbans. Yes, Sundarbans there is largest amount of mangroves, which are extensively in biodiversity. Biodiversity is very huge in those mangrove areas of Sundarban. The area transferred into national park is also home to threatened and endangered species like Royal Bengal tiger, fishing cats, macaques, leopard cats, wild boar, flying fox, pangolin, and Indian grey mongoose. The biodiversity hotspot attracts thousands of visitors every year, generating valuable revenue. So that also is a tourist hotspot, and various visitors or tourist that becomes a tourist place, and they visit, produce, and create more and more fishes. And if you cause overfishing, that means there will be ultimately decline in the number of fishes. Okay. And rapid urbanization are some of the glaring threats to the mangrove forest. Rapid urbanization, because of urbanization there is cutting of mangroves, and also for timber purposes they are misutilized and exploited heavily for timbers or for furniture woods. Mangrove forests around the world. Indirect threats to the mangroves include change in the sedimentation rates and patterns, rising sea levels, and increase in pollutants, and these are often exacerbated by human actions. Okay. Next. In Kenya, over reliance on mangroves for fuel because of lack of affordable alternatives, pollution from land-based sources, conversion of mangrove areas to other land uses such as salt mining settlements pose serious threats to the mangroves. Similarly, deforestation for fuel is the biggest threat in mangroves. Deforestation for fuel. Deforestation for fuel is the biggest threat to mangroves in Madagascar. Deforestation for fuel, right? For fuel wood, utilizing for fuel, deforestation, that is the biggest threat in the Madagascar. In Kenya, over reliance on mangroves because of lack of affordable alternatives, pollution from the land-based sources, conversion of mangrove areas to other land uses. Other land uses because of that salt mining, settlement pose serious threat, settlement, right? Conversion of mangrove areas to other, right? These are the various threats that go witnessed by the mangrove forest. And Mozambique is the lost more than 6% of mangrove cover in the last 20 years, mainly due to extraction of wood resources and deforestation, that is the timber resources, wood resources for furniture or any other purposes for urbanization, to create land for the salt pans and urban settlements. Deforestation is for urban settlements as well. Solar salt production, which involves clearing and selective logging, alternative microhabitats, microclimates, is also a threat to mangroves. Microhabitats, microclimates, for example, for tourist purposes, microhabitats are created, that also hamper the threat of mangroves. In India, Sundarbans, salinization, population pressure and overexploitation are the primarily threats to the mangroves and areas biodiversity. The Sundarbans are sandwiched between densely populated poor rural areas and a rising sea. That is sandwiched between densely populated poor rural areas. And there is a rising sea. So the coastal people, they are facing a lot of crisis. Predominantly they will face the cyclone, the effects of natural disasters. These climatic and demographic challenges contribute to the degradation of the immensely fertile and the biodiversity hotspot. Right, Sundarban is a biodiversity hotspot. They are poor people, so poor people they depend on the livelihoods on their, so they are economically dependent on the mangrove forest, right? And they are not because of the urbanization, those areas area in which they are living, they are also cutting the mangrove forest and the timbers for material uses. So this ultimately that becomes a threat for the Sundarban mangrove forest. And what are the hurdles for the building? Next is about your education. What are the hurdles for building schools for tribals? Right, government is pushing around 740 Ekalabya model residential schools, EMRS, Ekalabya model residential schools for tribal students. Right, one is in every sub-district has at the list around 20,000 odd scheduled tribe population, must have 50% of population in that area. So the condition for Ekalabya model residential school is one in each of the every sub-district that has at least 20,000 odd scheduled tribe population, in which must be 50% total population of that area. So among the total population, at least 50% should be tribals and at least 20,000 tribals should be there in those areas. Then there will be establishment of Ekalabya model residential schools in those areas for tribal educations, right? The government is persisting with the mission despite the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Social Justice and Ministry noting that this year the population criteria was impractical. Population criteria means we say that must 50%. So that in a particular area, if suppose tribal area is 40% or 30%, in very small areas except the northeastern areas, it is very difficult to find in such areas in which 50% of the population will be tribals. In that case, if you are not establishing the Ekalabya model residential schools, then what will happen? Ultimately, the tribal people are suffering. Ultimately, they will suffer. Their educational requirement will not be fulfilled. They will not get a proper opportunity to study because tribals, in so far as literacy is concerned, it is highly low in case of tribals among all other sections. So special focus and special schools, special curriculum, that is essential for the tribal education. And in that area, if you make such criteria that only 50%, those where 50% people are tribal, then only will establish such type of Eklavya model residential schools, that will hamper the tribal education greatly. That is suggested by the Standing Committee of the Social Justice. Here two things. One is state has limited resources. State cannot open huge number of residential schools because it has limited resources, obviously. Another thing is that our budgetary contribution to education is very less. That is not according to Kothari Commission. There is 1960, there is a Kothari Commission. It says that at least 6% of GDP should be spent for education, and at present, no state government, we are not spending 6% of GDP in education. It is highly 3 to 4%. So we have to increase the budgetary support for that, and government is not prioritizing that much the education as recommended by the Kothari Commission, because we have to make another other priority areas also. We have to spend for infrastructure, we have to spend for the research and development, for police, for other things, many other things, for health, for agriculture. So government has different priorities. Based on that, so in the limited resources, government has brought this criteria that 50% of total population should be tribal. Okay. But that is criticized by the Standing Committee on Social Justice and Ministry. Okay. When the idea was mooted, the EMRS model was first introduced in 1997-1998. To provide quality education in the tribal areas. Okay. Tribal students with residential facilities in remote corners. The aim was to build schools at par with the Jawaharlal Navodaya Vidyalaya. Right, Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas, in which especially the meritorious students are get selected, and they are provided high quality education, and also in residential model. But it is only the difference is that in case of Jawaharlal Navodaya Vidyalaya, any student can go and join Jawaharlal Navodaya Vidyalaya or JNV. But in case of this Eklavya model residential schools, only tribals will join, and that model will be similar to JNV. Okay. So here tribals have the greater chances to join it and get the opportunity for higher education and quality education. In 2018 and 19, the scheme was overseen by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs with the maximum control of identifying new schools, recruiting and management, and admissions lying with the state governments. So it has found that maximum all this control lies with the state governments, or to the state governments up to what. And while the union government had sanctioned a certain number of preliminary EMRS, the guideline of the scheme noted in the states and union territories would be responsible for seeking the sanction of new schools and when they are needed it. So it is the major role lies with the state governments. When state governments they will wish the major role regarding identifying the schools, identifying the area, granting the permission to that area for establishment of schools depends on the states. The funds for the schools were come from the grants under the Article 275. And the guidelines mandated unless the states finish the constructing the schools sanctioned by the central government. So once they finish the construction of the schools, then the grants will come. So here there are conditionalities imposed by the central government under Article 375. That means if the state government is not sufficiently, if it has not completed the construction of a particular school, they will not get the grant. So it also depends on it depends on the efficiency of the state government as well. If the state governments which are actively implementing the schemes or actively constructing the various EMRS schools, they will get more fund as from the centers. They will not be entitled to funds for the new ones. Yes, those are not completed the previous ones, they will not be entitled to the funds for the new ones. Apart from infrastructure requirements, 20-acre plots for each EMRS, the guidelines didn't have any such criteria where the EMRS could be established, leaving up to the discretion of the state governments. So it is of the state governments where it will select the lands, that is the problem of land acquisition as well, and where it will establish the school. And obviously the minimum requirement area is 20 acre in a particular school is required for the school development. So that minimum area need to be selected by the state government. And central government has not given any such guideline with respect to that. It is completely up to the state government where it will select the schools. When it was revamped in 2018 and 19, the cabinet approved the revamping of the EMRS scheme. Okay, the new guidelines gave the union government more power to sanction the schools and the management. So here the larger power now come to the union government because it has seen that state government are not prioritizing establishing these EMRS schools, right? Neither they are actively constructing the buildings, neither they are actively getting the money, right? They are ignoring these things. So now greater control comes under the central government. So central government will actively monitor the function power, and as they are getting more powers by the new guidelines. The National Education Society for the Tribal Students, NESTS, was set up and entrusted with the management of the State Education Society for Tribal Students, which should run EMRS on the ground. So there is new body that is called as National Education Society for Tribal Students, NEST. It was set up and entrusted the management that will be responsible for management of the State Education Society for Tribal Students that will run the EMRS school. The new guidelines set a target of setting of EMRS in every tribal sub-district and introduce population criteria for setting them up. Population criteria, it has again introduced the population criteria for setting them up. So in different tribal areas, the reason is that primarily we have to focus those areas which are highly densely populated by tribals, right? After achieving this the target, the government may set up new targets or change the guidelines to go to those areas where tribals are less dominated and establishing a school there. So the area which are highly dominated by tribals will be prioritized at first. The new guidelines also reduce the minimum and land requirements and from 20 acres to 15 acres. Since the new scheme was put into place, Ministry of Tribal Affairs sanctioned 332 of the targeted 450 schools in 2001 and 2021-22. So around the Ministry of Tribal Affairs has already sanctioned 332 tribal schools. That is 330 schools are already sanctioned by the central government or the Ministry of Tribals out of 450 schools. However, standing committee in its report noted that a large number of schools were being delayed because of the area 15-acre requirement, and the population criteria is making the identification acquisition of land more cumbersome. Now there is another problem. Problem is that whether you prioritize the infrastructure or you will only prioritize the education. If you are prioritizing the infrastructure, then you need 15-acre land, and if you are not getting a 15-acre unified land, it is a very difficult task. Land acquisition is always a lengthy process, it is a cumbersome process. Another thing is that if you are not bringing that, if you are not focusing on infrastructure, you will only focus on education, then overall development of tribals will not happen, because we see that in many sports the contributions of tribals are very, very huge, especially in case of football, in hockey. So ignoring the, for example, a playground, for example, areas infrastructure. So if that 15-acre land criteria will not be, that will be ignored, then we can establish more schools, and that will, another problem is that will hamper the overall growth of the students, right? So that is a challenge. Either you have to focus on the only education or the overall development of the students. If you are focusing on the overall development of the students, all round development, then you need more area. That is a delayed process. That's why we are able to establish few number of schools. And some state governments are not active with respect to the construction of the school buildings. Okay, especially in hilly areas, getting this amount of land is very difficult, because in hilly areas and left-wing extremism areas, there we can find huge number of tribals. Simple thing is this, because tribals, we will not find a huge concentration of tribals in the urban areas, right? In hilly areas or remote areas, we will see that 50% population criteria, where 50% will be tribals, that will find in the hilly regions, and finding 15-acre land or 20-acre land in unified land in the hilly region is a big challenge. It noted that even though a new guidelines provided for the relaxation of these areas, other problems with the land acquisition continued to persist. The standing committee noted that population criteria ran risk of depriving scattered tribal population or the benefit of EMRS. The standing committee noted that the population criteria ran the risk of depriving a scattered tribal population. Yes. So those tribals who are scattered, that means who are not concentrated, now they are not getting the benefit of EMRS scheme, EMRS schools. Now they suffer. So those tribals who are fragmented or for any socio-economic purposes. For example, if a family is going to work somewhere for any socio-economic purposes, if they are not getting concentrated in a particular area, or their number is not 20,000 or more than 15% of the total area, then they will not be entitled to a EMRS school in those areas, and that deprive them from that opportunity. Okay. What is the current status? The Tribal Affairs Ministry insists that maintaining the new criteria, as of November 2022, a total of 688 schools have been sanctioned, in which 390 acres are functional. Of the 688, 230 have completed construction and 234 are under construction. 230 have completed the constructions. Correct. Tribal Affairs is maintaining the new criteria. As of November, total of 688 schools have been sanctioned. Total 688 schools have been sanctioned by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and 392 are functionals, and 230 have completed the construction and 234 are under construction. 32 schools are struck due to land acquisition issues. Right. As for the serving less dense tribal population, the Minister of Tribal Affairs will take care of after the targeted 740 schools under this criteria are built. Right. So now primarily the government target is that those areas where highly concentrated tribals are there, initially will establish those 740 schools will establish. Right. After the establishment of densely tribal areas, after the establishment of schools in those densely populated tribal areas, reduce the criteria. For example, that 50% will reduce to 25%, and we can get some more schools under that. Okay. Next, some prelim facts. What is Sea Vigil 22? The third edition of the Pan India Coastal Defence Exercise Sea Vigil 22 will be conducted in 15 November. It is a coastal defence exercise, Pan India Coastal Defence Exercise, that is Sea Vigil 22. Okay. This national level coastal defence exercise was conceptualized in 2018 to validate various measures that have been instituted towards the enhancing maritime security since 26/11. After 26/11, the Mumbai attack, that primarily that happened because of the lack of the maritime security. Right. That happened in Mumbai attack because of terrorists that came through the sea route. That's why we developed our Indian Coast Guard. We have developed NIA. We developed NatGrid after that, and we are also developing the Coast Guard and the maritime security. So maritime security, that becomes another, that is a big challenge, that is a big important security aspect. And national coastal level defence exercise, that is why it was conducted. National level coastal defence exercise, that is Sea Vigil, is conducted for maritime security. Coastal security being a measure of subset of coastal defence construct, Sea Vigil to activate the coastal security apparatus across the India and accesses the overarching coastal defence mechanism. The exercise will be undertaken under entire 7516 km coastline. Entire 7516 of coastline. This is the total length of our coastline, that is 7516 coastline. The exercise will be undertaken along the whole coastline and exclusive economic zones of India. Exclusive economic zone of India means from our border around 200 nautical miles. From Indian border, maritime border, for our terrestrial border, up to 200 nautical miles we have exclusive economic, for 12 nautical miles we have exclusive economic zone. For 200 nautical miles we have territorial water. Okay. Exclusive economic zone in India will be involved the coastal states and union territories along with other maritime stakeholders, including the fishing and coastal communities. So that exercise will take care, that will include the stakeholders. That means the fishing, the fishermen and also other communities, fishing communities, because they are also ear and eye of our coastal community, and they are the ear and eye of our maritime security, because they may provide information if they found anything suspicious in the maritime area. That is a very big area, right? Ocean area is a very big area, and getting the proper information from the fisherman is also very relevant. The exercise is being conducted by the Indian Navy in coordination with the Coast Guard and other ministries entrusted with the task of maritime activities, that is Indian Navy and Coast Guard. Coast Guard is also created after 26/11 for maritime security. Indian Navy and Coast Guard, they jointly conduct this exercise. The scale conceptual expanse of the exercise is unprecedented in terms of geographical extent. and number of stakeholders involved, the number of units participating in terms of objectives to be met. The exercise is built up to towards the major theatre level readiness operational exercise, that is TROPEX, which the Indian Navy conducts every 2 years. There is another exercise, that is TROPEX, that is theatre level readiness operational exercise. That is also conducted by Indian Navy, right? Sea Vigil and TROPEX together will cover entire spectrum of maritime security. Sea Vigil and TROPEX. Remember these two for prelims facts. Sea Vigil and TROPEX. Together will cover entire spectrum of maritime security. Assets of the Indian Navy, Coast Guard, Customs and other maritime agencies will participate in the exercise Sea Vigil. Indian Navy, Coast Guard and Customs and other maritime agencies, they will participate in the Sea Vigil and TROPEX exercise. The Ministry of Defence, the conduct of the exercise is also being facilitated by the Ministries of Home Affairs, right? Home Affairs, which is largely responsible for the internal security, port, shipping and waterways, petroleum, natural gas, fisheries, animal husbandry, dairying, customs and other agencies of the center and the state, they are also participating in the Sea Vigil exercise. The conduct of exercise of Sea Vigil at the national level is aimed at serve as a larger purpose. It provides opportunity at an apex level to access preparedness in the domain of maritime security and coastal defence. In the domain of maritime security and coastal defence, exercise Sea Vigil 22 will provide realistic assessment of the strengths and weakness of the maritime security and further strengthening our maritime national security. So that will give us the weakness. What are the weakness that will be identified in the exercise Sea Vigil. Then long-term low emission development strategy. India submitted its long-term low emission development strategy to the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, that is UNFCCC. Long-term low emission development strategy. United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, during the 27th Conference of Parties, that is COP27. Long-term low emission development strategy, right? What is this long-term low emission development strategy? India has promised, that is in its INDC, that is Intended National Determined Commitment. The long-term low emission development strategy was launched by the Union Government Minister of Environment, Forest, Climate Change, Sri Bhupender Yadav. Sri Bhupender Yadav, the Environment Minister, has launched it. Who is leading to the Indian delegation COP27, being held at the Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt from 16 to 18 November 2022. The salient features of the strategy in which focus will be on the rational utilization of the national resources with due regard to energy security. Rational utilization of, that is the rational utilization of national resources with due regard to the energy security. The national mission launched in 2021 aims to make India green hydrogen hub. Green hydrogen is created from water by electrolysis process. Green hydrogen hub, the rapid expansion of green hydrogen production, increasing electrolyzer manufacturing capacity in the country, and threefold increase in the nuclear capacity, right? We have to increase the threefold increase in the nuclear capacity by 2032. Some of the other milestones are envisaged alongside the overall development and power sector, so that we can reduce the carbon emissions. Increase the use of biofuels, especially ethanol blending. Biofuels are increasing. Now we have a target of 20% of biofuels by 2025. That is called as ethanol blending in petrol. Drive to electric vehicles penetration by 2028. We are targeting that there will be nobody will purchase. Everybody will purchase the electric vehicle. The increased use of green hydrogen in India aspires to maximum the use of electric vehicles in ethanol blending to reach 20% by 2025. These are the targets we have already promised and targeted. While urbanization will continue as a strong trend from the current relatively base, the future sustainable climate resilient infrastructure development will be driven by smart city initiative. What do you mean by Climate resilient urban development. Climate resilient urban development means in urban areas also there will be microforest, development of microforest, for example, in a particular area. Suppose this is an area in which an urban city is going to be established. So there will be area for microforest. Okay, that is we can say that okay, that is environmentally sustainable. India's industrial sector low carbon development transitions should not impact energy security. Energy access and employment. Focus will be on improving energy efficiency by perform, achieve and trade. That scheme. For perform, achieve and trade scheme for energy efficiency. Right. National hydrogen emission, high level of electrification, all relevant processes and activities, enhancing material efficiency, recycling leading expansion of circular economy, exploring options for hard to abate sectors that are steel, cement, aluminium, all are essential for achieving the goal regarding to climate change. So recycling is important, energy efficiency is important, implementation of smart city missions and climate resilient urban development, PAD scheme, all they are relevant. Okay.